Welcome to our Fireside chat on modern Hopfield networks at NeurIPS 2020, organized by us, IRA, the Institute of Advanced Research in Artificial Intelligence. We're an independent, academic, and open institution. To find out more about us, visit us on our virtual booth here at NeurIPS, where you can also find more events that we are hosting here, including a Fireside chat on Performer Networks tomorrow. We are proud to have with us today at our virtual campfire two movers and shakers in the recent revival of interest in modern variants of Hopfield networks. From IBM Research and formerly the Institute of Advanced Studies, I welcome Dmitry Krotov, as well as IRA's very own founding director and professor at the Ellis Unit at the Johannes Kepler University in Linz, Sepp Hochreiter. Today's format is that both our guests give a 10-minute or so introduction of their take on the topic at hand, and will then jointly explore modern Hopfield networks in discussion. Without further ado, Dima and Sepp, I yield the floor to you.
Michael, thanks a lot. Also a warm welcome from my side. I will start with a short presentation. I'm talking about our new take on modern Hopfield networks. I will refer to Dima's work. He will then go further on it. Hopfield networks, old guys from the 80s, and I want to show you why they can be of use again, and that's a new development thanks to Dmitry and others. Our goal is to use modern Hopfield networks to advance deep learning, to equip deep learning architectures by associative memories. You see here a deep learning architecture on the right-hand side, a deep learning architecture, and now the deep learning architecture is in each layer equipped with an associative memory. And this brings us to deep learning, which goes beyond convolutional neural networks or recurrent neural networks. Our goal is to use modern Hopfield networks and integrate them in two layers of deep learning architectures, and thereby integrating associative memory capabilities into deep learning. And this should enable the association of two sets, pattern search in sets, pooling operations, memories, we know them from LSTMs or GRUs, learning prototypes, attention mechanisms like in transformers, sequence-to-sequence learning, point set processing, multiple instance learning, and things like k-nearest neighbor, support vector machines, or learning vector quantization. Modern Hopfield networks, pioneered by Dmitry Krotov and John Hopfield. There was this seminal paper in 2016, and they showed us an architecture which tremendously increased the storage capacity. It's not the linear capacity we know from classical standard Hopfield networks. It's now polynomial, and this was even increased by using a different energy function by Dimiry in 2017. And another property is they converge extremely fast. The standard Hopfield networks date back to the 60s, 70s, and they were popularized by John Hopfield in 1982. Here, an example on the top, a standard binary Hopfield network. This is a Simpson. Then you want to retrieve something from the patterns on the left-hand side. You have a masked pattern of Homer, and you see, because the patterns are highly correlated, it doesn't work very well. If you use this modern binary Hopfield network of Dmitry, then this works. And you can even store many, many more patterns. And even if patterns are overlaying correlated, this works. These are cool things, these binary Hopfield networks, but there's one problem for us. We attempt to integrate them into deep learning architectures. Like here, we want to do it in a layer, but still we want to use backpropagation. We still want to use gradient descent, and therefore we need them to be continuous, to be differentiable. We want to use backpropagation. And another thing what we try to keep, one of the cool properties is there's a retrieval with one update. You do one update and you almost have retrieved some patterns, because one update corresponds to an activation of a layer. Therefore, we have something like we activate one layer which resembles retrieval procedure of a Hopfield network. And we also want to have the high storage capacity, what this modern Hopfield network give you. Therefore, we proposed a new energy function and a new update rule. It's given here. I don't want to go into that. The idea is take the ideas of the binary modern Hopfield networks and transfer these ideas to continuous Hopfield networks. And the energy function is here. And at the bottom here you see the corresponding update rule. We propose this update rule. This energy function together with the update rule give us some properties. The first property is the update rule guarantees convergence. Convergence to a minimum, also sometimes to settle points, but it's very unlikely we will go to a minimum of the energy function. But still, inherited from this binary Hopfield networks, we have this high storage capacity, exponentially large storage capacity, exponential in the dimension of the patterns, of the dimension of the space in which the patterns we want to store live. And very important for our use, retrieval with one update. What we mean there, if we do one update, we are epsilon close to the stored pattern. Therefore, we are saying that's sufficient for us to get the pattern back. And the retrieval with one update means we can use these Hopfield networks like an activation of a normal layer of a standard deep learning architecture. And also the retrieval error should be exponentially small, which is also guaranteed if the pattern are well separated, if one pattern is far away from other patterns and they don't overlay heavily. Here, an example of this new modern Hopfield networks with continuous activations. Here's activations are continuous. You see this in this grayscale, and Homer could be very well retrieved, even if this image is overlaying with many other images, is highly correlated. But this modern Hopfield networks were able to pull these images apart and retrieve the image, even if half of the image is masked out, as you see here. Now, the interesting fact is the update rule I showed you is actually nothing else than the attention mechanism, which is very well known from transformers, from these modern architectures used in NLP, natural language processing. This is the transformer update, and this is the same as the update rule we used, which I introduced. You only have to rewrite different things like this part we call beta and so forth. But we can rewrite our formula, our update formula, also as an attention mechanism. Therefore, the transformer attention can be viewed as a Hopfield network, as a modern Hopfield network, as a Hopfield network with continuous states. Now we have this Hopfield network with continuous states, which have high capacity. And now we want to integrate it into a deep learning architecture. I already told you we can make transformer models, but we can do much more. We can do much more. And what we want to do depends on two things. What patterns we want to store. There are many possibilities what I want to store in each layer. And what are the queries, what I'm looking for, how I define the queries. And there's an overview here. The most native thing is the queries which are here and the wiser stored patterns came from previous layers. Therefore, you store some information from previous layers and the queries, all the information from previous layers, ask some memory. But you can do different. You can also do like you learn the queries. The queries are fixed patterns, and you store always training set here, or mapped training set. And this allows for something like multiple instance learning, because the training set is stored in the associative memory. Or you can store in these memories sequences, and you can do stuff like LSTMs are doing. And then there's the last application where the memory is filled with something. It could be intermediate results from previous layers. It could be the training data. It could be prototypes, database information, whatever you can think of, you can load in. And during learning, you always can generate new queries, and the queries ask the associative memory. For example, you can also store perhaps training examples which were hard to store. You can store something like support vectors. You can store prototypes. You can do learning vector quantization. You can do support vector machines if you store support vectors. You can do even k-nearest neighbor search. If you store something, you can do also k-nearest neighbor search on intermediate results. There are a plethora of new possibilities how to build new deep learning architectures, and this gives you a big toolbox of creating new architectures and getting new state-of-the-arts. We already got state-of-the-arts in multiple instance learning and many other tasks from deep learning. That's from my side. Thank you. I will stop now. And Dmitry, it's your floor now.
First of all, Michael, thanks so much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be part of this very nice event. In this short presentation, what I wanted to notice is that the concept of Hopfield nets stands in between three disciplines, such as physics, machine learning, and neuroscience and cognitive sciences. And I wanted to begin this discussion by highlighting the differences between standard Hopfield networks and modern Hopfield networks, or dense associative memories, from the perspective of these three disciplines. So let me begin with the physics point of view. In physics, there is a long tradition of studying so-called spin glass systems. Typically, the typical question that people tend to ask in this field looks like this. So people start with some complicated expression for the energy function, like the one that is shown in this slide. So the energy function depends on a bunch of parameters, or weights for the neural network, which in turn depend on the memory vectors psi. And the energy also depends on the state of the neural network, that is denoted here by the letter V. And the kind of typical question that physicists like to ask about such systems is the following. What kind of minima does this energy function have, and how many of those minima does it have? And it turns out that minima, that local minima of this energy function, they come into two flavors. The first kind of minima is so-called the memory state. And the second kind of minima is called the spin glass state. So in the memory state, if you take the state of the network in the minimum, and you can always find one pattern psi, so that the overlap between that pattern and the state of the neural network is large. And in the spin glass state, that overlap is small. Now, what is large and what is small? So imagine that we're talking about binary vectors. So let's say that Vi is an Ising kind of variable, which is a combination of plus and minus ones. And let's say that psi is also a combination of plus and minus ones. Then large means that this overlap should be of the order of n, which is the size of the neural network. N is the number of neurons. And small means that it should be much smaller than that. For example, 0.5 n would be small. And basically, the conclusion from studying various minima of standard Hamiltonians or energy functions in this field of spin glasses comes to the following conclusion, that basically there are two kinds of minima. There are spin glass states and there are memory states. But in the classical Hamiltonians, so classical Hopfield networks, the majority of local minima are actually spin glass states. So there's only a very small number of those blue errors. And sometimes you don't have blue errors at all. And that happens in the regime when the number of memories that we are trying to put into the system is sufficiently large. Now, the idea behind modern Hopfield network was to try to specifically engineer the shape of this energy function in such a way so that instead of having a lot of spin glass states and very few memory states, all the local minima of the Hamiltonian or the energy function are memory states. And that's what is shown in this diagram that you can see on the right. And kind of, these statements that you can often hear that modern Hopfield networks have a much bigger capacity, memory storage capacity than the standard Hopfield networks. It's kind of, a slight rephrasing of this phenomenon that I have just described to you in the physics language. Now, let's move on to the biology perspective. So in biology, the most important aspect of modern Hopfield networks, the most kind of essential feature of those systems is that they can store a large number of patterns. Now, let me illustrate why this might be useful from the perspective of two biological systems. Let me start with the auditory system. Imagine that we do the following experiment. We invite an accomplished musician and we put that person in the corner of the room and we play a little piece of music on the piano keyboard. If the musician is good enough, he or she would be able to perfectly write down the score for the short piece of music that we have just played, which suggests that somewhere inside the brain of that person, there is an internal representation for at least every key on the piano keyboard. Now, let's think for a second about biophysics of hearing system. And here I'm going to do a little bit of a simplification, and I'm going to ignore phase shifts between waves of different frequencies. But if we're talking about single frequency sounds, roughly speaking, the story goes like this. So the entire frequency range that a human ear can hear ranges between, roughly speaking, 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. And this whole range is covered by approximately 24 channels. And basically, whenever a certain frequency is present, some number of channels get excited. And essentially, every sound that we can hear can be described by the combination of 24 real numbers, which corresponds to the amplitude in those 24 channels. Thus, we have this kind of very interesting system when the dimensionality of the input space is relatively small. It is equal to 24. Yet, from this experiment with the musician, we understand that the number of patterns that such system should deal with is much bigger than 24. And obviously, if you try to model the system from the perspective of a standard conventional classical Hopfield network, you would immediately see that there is a problem, because classical Hopfield network can only store successfully 0.14 NF, where NF is the number of features, patterns. And if NF is equal to 24, then 0.14 multiplied by 24 is a very small number. Despite of that, dense associative memories can easily solve this problem. So the second example that I want to briefly discuss pertains to color vision. And again, from the biophysics perspective, every color that we see that we can reason of comes in as a combination of three numbers, which are intensities of the cone cells in the blue part of the electromagnetic spectrum, in the green part, and in the red part. And in this little diagram here, you can see the wave length sensitivities of pigments in the cone cells. So again, we have a story when fundamentally, biophysically, every color is described by a combination of three real numbers. But at the same time, if you look at the 25 randomly generated colors in this portion of the slide on the right, you can by and large name many of them. And even if you cannot name some of them, you can reason about them using natural language. You can, for example, say something like this. This color looks like a color of the blue sky. So again, we have a situation when the dimensionality of the input is very small and fixed. And at the same time, the number of patterns that behaviorally the system should be able to deal with is much bigger than that. And that's kind of the reason why I think modern Hopfield networks are particularly interesting from the biological perspective as well. And here at the bottom of the slide, you can see a recent paper that we put out on arXiv where we discuss its mathematical structures and some of these biological examples. Now, finally, let me briefly say something about machine learning. And here I copied this figure from this very nice paper, Language Models Are Few-Shot Learners, that is being presented at this conference, NeurIPS 2020. And what is going on here is the following. So on the x-axis, so first of all, we have a pre-trained large language model. So here we're talking about GPT-3. And the model was trained on a huge amount of text. And then after the model is trained and all the weights are already fixed, we are going to present the model with a novel task. For example, we can take a word and we can scramble the letters in one or another way. Now, it turns out that if we give that novel task to the neural network initially, with the zero-shot learning, the network doesn't really work very well. However, if we show to the network a couple of examples of this novel task, for example, 10 examples, you can see that the performance of the network improves quite substantially. And you might want to ask a question, why does it have anything to do with Hopfield networks, and what might be a possible explanation of this phenomenon? So we all know that the core computational motif, the core computational element of these large language models is the attention mechanism. And thanks to the recent results on modern Hopfield networks, we also know that attention mechanism is nothing but a one-step update of a modern Hopfield network, of a very special kind of modern Hopfield network. And if you kind of put all those, and we also know that Hopfield networks can store a lot of patterns. So if you kind of put all these ingredients together, it is tempting to think about these results in the following way. You can think that during training time, these models have memorized a huge number of various patterns. And at test time, the model doesn't really know which basin of attraction it should focus on. However, if you prime it a little bit, if you present to it a couple of examples of the novel task, you gently push that model into the correct basin of attraction. And once it reaches that basin of attraction, it can, perfectly, or not perfectly, but it can solve the novel task reasonably well. So I think that's kind of one possible way of thinking about these recent results in language as few-shot learners. So I think I'm going to stop here, and we can continue discussion during the follow-up questions.
Thank you, Dmitry. A very interesting talk, and gave me a complete new insights. Perhaps let me start with a statement, perhaps something like what we are now doing in deep learning is kind of function approximation. What we already know, we had splines, we have the orthogonal function basis and stuff like this. But I think from the perspective of biology, where you are more at home than me, that's not what like humans are doing, and that's not what complex systems should do. They should equip the function approximation with some context. Store things, perhaps you have some rules, perhaps the rules go into your neural networks, but at the other hand, perhaps you want to store some exceptional situations, some things which you did not encounter often enough. You have to combine both things. Sometimes there are rules, you fit good the rules, but sometimes there are exceptions. I think we have to design the new kind of deep learning architectures, the new deep learning systems with context, with associative memories, no matter how they look like. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I certainly think that modern deep learning architectures would definitely benefit from something like some external memory, and many people are thinking about this question, obviously. And I also completely share with you, and by the way, I really loved your diagrams that you showed in your talk, that you kind of you have these new elements that have both memory inputs and the kind of inputs from the previous layers. And I think indeed kind of in the future, what we might want to try to do is to kind of try to, so let me start from the beginning. Currently, we train all the neural networks using backpropagation algorithm, right? And that's a cool thing to do. It obviously has some advantages. But at the same time, like particularly given these diagrams that you have shown in your talk, I think it might be also interesting to sort of try to train various parts of those modules using different methods. For example, you could imagine that you could train some of those matrices that you have shown, like W with various subscripts, right? Some of those matrices can be trained using a backpropagation algorithm, but some others could be just, trained using some form of Hebbian learning. And in Hebbian learning, you often do encounter situations which is similar to what you have just described, that, you have some distribution of data, and you have some area of the space where you have a lot of data. And that's kind of the region where you want to do some kind of consolidation of that data. But then there are outliers, right? And there are outliers that are kind of, some bizarre points that are located far away from the major mass of the data distribution. And sometimes it may be a wise thing just to explicitly memorize those outliers. And kind of, you could do some form of Hebbian learning to try to consolidate them, but also you can just memorize them as is, as individual instances of the events. And I think this is indeed kind of, a very interesting idea that is not so popular yet, but I think at some point we might want to look, at those problems from these alternative learning methods perspective, so to speak.
As also, I would go so far, then we can also introduce emotions to neural networks, because emotions would be good to decide what to store. If you're frightened, if you don't do well, you want to store, do you remember this bad situation as a neural network? If you did very well, perhaps you also want to memorize this. And we humans have emotions, we have these feelings, but perhaps they're only to fill our memories with the right stuff, with the helpful stuff in the future. Perhaps it's too far-fetched to say it's emotions, but we also have at some point then have to think about what is interesting to store. What is interesting to store from a previous layer, from my previous experience, and so forth. And then we don't only have some memory thing, but also I did it in LSTM. You have to a gating mechanism. You have to a mechanism how to decide what to store. Do you know something biology? How biology or how a brain would solve stuff like this?
Right. So in biology, typically what is happening is the following. So let's say that you look at a black screen, right? And then you measure like some activities of some neurons in that are responsible for visual perception. And your neurons don't fire. Then something appears at the screen. For example, I don't know, a white square in the middle of the screen. Then you can find a neuron that begins to fire. And initially the neuron is like very excited. It produces a lot of action potentials. But then if that's kind of, square stays there, it suddenly, it's at some point stops. So it adapts and, it doesn't really produce spikes anymore. But then if, for example, the square goes away and disappears, it again begins to fire. So there are all kinds of, examples of that sort of behavior in biology. And I would say biology tends to kind of attempt to pay attention to things that are changing, right? So there should be some kind of element of surprise. So, so I would say if I try to kind of take this broad inspiration from biology and try to build some useful AI system, I would focus on this kind of element of surprise, so that the network should be somehow surprised to see something that it does not expect.
I see. A recent example is AlphaFold. There are rumors use attention mechanism, which makes completely sense to me. If you have different sequences to analyze, you want to store some result, look back, know with the new results where to look, where to refine, where to compute further. And this would be like memorizing intermediate results or different things. But I'm very excited what the actual architecture is, because I can think basically they also have some memory of previous computations, stuff like this. but the paper is not out right now.
Yeah, we don't really know what's going on there, right?
But I'm sure there are some attention mechanisms involved. And I think we will hear more of this new achievements with these new architectures. You can call it Hopfield networks, you can call it attention, it's the same. I think, and if we tackle the really, really hard challenges, I think we have to do it. And you mentioned something, I think, key to few-shot learning is also memory, because sometimes you just memorize what is the closest example, like K nearest neighbor kind of stuff. Sometimes you build up a rule, but if you have to learn from few examples, what's better than at least memorize these few examples, or memorize very similar task, what you did in similar tasks, stuff like this. I think few-shot learning really would profit from using memories, from using something like Hopfield memories.
I completely agree. I completely agree, and I think it's just, you know, what we are witnessing right now is just the beginning of, you know, of the community beginning to explore those questions. I think we will see much more exciting results. I hope. Yeah.
And the question is also with transformers and stuff. Do we store all the information, all these things in the feed-forward weights, or are they stored in this memory kind of thing? Because now you have two possibilities to store your training set, what you have experienced previously, and what's your take on this? You have two kinds of things. You have this external memory, you have this memory, but you also have this weights which change slower. How do you see this perhaps also from the biological point of view?
I mean, in biology, you could imagine all kinds of time scales for weights changes, right? You can imagine that, you know, certain weights are changing very rapidly, certain other weights are changing much more slowly. So, for example, if you go to this like paper that we put out like earlier this year on large associative memory problem. So like that model, it's a very simple model, of course, it's very far from biology, but still it has like some biological flavor in it. And in that model, there are two kinds of neurons, right? There are hidden neurons and there are feature neurons. And the hidden neurons and the feature neurons, they have time constants for their response. So like the reactions of neurons can happen on different time scales for sure. But also the learning mechanism that is responsible for changing synaptic weights can also happen on very different time scales. And kind of, you know, typically in this, you know, neuroscience-inspired machine learning, we think about weights as changing slowly and neurons' activity as changing quickly. But of course, like within that range, quickly and slowly, there could be all kinds of sub-ranges where some of the neurons react more fast than others and some of the weights are changing more fast than others. So biologically, there's no rule that should not happen. So it's kind of, it certainly is allowed. And if it's good for the performance of the AI system, I think that's totally fine to design systems like this.
Yeah, I agree. Also, if you think about what is out now, System 1 learning and System 2 learning, I think for System 2 learning, you need also something like a memory, because System 2 learning, like few-shot learning, fast learning, learning with high concepts, you only have few examples. You don't want to have like a HEP rule only for one example, but perhaps you want to HEP rule and all stored examples pop out and you make a connection to the best stored pattern, because otherwise if you have a few examples and only you can connect to your current environment, that's not very efficient. You should connect your current situation with all your experiences. And I think System 2 learning, not only is the sensory learning where we are now very good, it's vision, it's speech. If we are learning on an abstract level, I think we need memory. We have to connect a new thing with things we already know, which we can pull out where we see it's similar. And I believe, yes, it should go in this direction if we want to go to the next step of AI.
Yeah. Sepp, may I also ask you a question? I always wanted to ask, but never had a chance. Maybe now is a good time. Like, you know, in this, this analogy, like mathematical equivalence, so to speak, that you showed in your paper, right? That, you know, there is a tension mechanism and Hopfield networks in one step reduces to it. But do you think there are examples where multiple steps would be good? Like, what if we just go beyond one single step attention? Would that be an interesting thing to do? Would it be good for some kind of problems to have this sort of dynamical convergence to a fixed point?
What we observed right now is if a pattern is well separated, one update is sufficient because you're so close to the fixed point that you know what pattern it should be, or you don't have to be super precise. It's different what we called metastable states. Perhaps you have you're in the middle of 3, 4, 5 patterns, and there it could mean you're with one update you're in the middle of this pattern. But in the metastable state, you need a couple of more updates to precisely say, I'm closer to this or to this fellow. I don't know, we didn't have these examples where it helps, but I can imagine that you now want to know from what side do I came. I have similar patterns, but I'm more similar to one or the other. Or I want to have exactly the average of this. But right now, it was like one step was sufficient because other layers, if you're not precise enough, can compensate this, would learn how to compensate the error. And that was easier than to do multiple updates. But it could be, I never know. You're right, you're right.
Because I mean, like, again, kind of speaking, again, speaking broadly biologically, you could imagine that, you know, sometimes like if a pattern, if the query pattern is kind of ambiguous, the network might want to kind of go around and like inspect a few patterns before it decides, you know, which one works best for the specific query. So I can easily see, you know, some potential advantages of doing that. So
yeah, and even I also had it would be even more funny if the stored pattern can even change during convergence because something new comes in, you get a new visual input or whatever. You can imagine a lot of very complicated dynamics, but we didn't explore it. But yes, there are many researchers out there. I think there could be some fruitful directions to think in this direction. I think in the chat there's a question to you.
Yeah, yeah, I can read it out. Actually, it's from William Redman. The question is for you, Dima. Are you familiar with recent work from Michael Berry's lab on the structure of the retinal code? If so, do you see similarities between that and Hopfield networks?
Right. So I am not sure I'm familiar with the like most recent work that coming out of Michael Berry's lab, but I'm certainly familiar with you know, general line of work that his lab is doing, like studying you know, salamander retina responses to natural visual stimuli. So yeah, if you maybe could clarify specifically what aspects of the most recent results are you find similar to Hopfield networks, I could probably kind of meaningfully comment on that. But in general, kind of, I think maybe what you mean. Let me try to kind of to guess maybe what you're asking. Maybe you're asking something entirely different. So technically, one really nice aspect of modern Hopfield networks that I don't really think was sufficiently explored yet is the following. Imagine that you can look at some very crazily complicated data set. And you believe that there are some patterns there that are responsible for some behavior, but you don't really know what those patterns are. So what you could try to do, you could try to train, for example, I don't know, feed-forward classifier, like a multi-layer perceptron, and try to kind of, you know, predict certain patterns into like certain kinds of outcomes. And that's interesting because you can predict the outcomes for new instances, right? But at the same time, it's not really helpful from the perspective of kind of, you know, deciphering what pattern drives that response, because, you know, multi-layer perceptrons, they're generally not very interpretive. And the situation is quite different for modern Hopfield networks, because basically, because of these, you know, activation functions that kind of enforce sparsity in the hidden representation, their representations actually are much more interpretive. So, for example, if you have some crazily complicated data that you believe that contains some interesting pattern, but you don't really know what the pattern looks like. You might want to try to train a modern Hopfield network on that data set and then simply look at the weights, at the memories that this network learns. And those memories, they should be representative of the patterns. And you can actually look at them. In actually, like in our original paper, like from 2016, we tried to do similar kind of experiment on like the most simple thing that you can imagine on MNIST. And on MNIST, you can train dense associative memory and look at the feature detectors or representations that the latent layer learns. And you can actually see like certain prototypes of digits that emerge out of that procedure. And also you can see like some sub features of those digits, and like the representations, they strongly depend on the kind of nonlinearity that you use. So if you're kind of thinking about something like along those lines, I think there are many possibilities. If you're thinking about something else, then please clarify it, and I will try to.
Perhaps I have a question before you, Michael, come with it, Dmitry, because you mentioned something which I find very interesting. You said perhaps it's also sparsity. In contrast, because like this softmax which comes out or something, it's sparse. There's perhaps only one. You could call it these hidden neurons. A few of these hidden neurons perhaps are activated. But perhaps we can achieve sparsity in another way, not by this energy function, but I don't know, connectivity or whatever. I think perhaps is the energy function key or a sparsity key to get this cool behavior?
Yeah, so there are two questions. Should I answer or should someone else answer? I don't want to jump in.
No. We would like you to answer.
Yeah, so first of all, there is a ton of mechanisms in biology, actually, that can enforce sparsity. So let me give you one example. One example is the following. Imagine that you don't have these crazy energy functions, but instead you have lateral connections between the hidden neurons. So typically, like let's say that we think about multilayer perceptrons in deep learning, right? We have input, then we have a hidden representation, and we have a feed-forward projection. Now imagine that hidden units interact with each other. There is an inhibitory loop. If one hidden neuron gets excited, it suppresses the activities of other neurons. So it's a kind of recurrent neural network that constantly is doing something in the hidden layer. So if you do that, you can easily implement mechanisms like winner takes all, or you can make, you can design neural network that activate, 5 neurons at a time, or some small subset of neurons at a time. There are all kinds of architectures that allow you to do that. And right. So in the second question, whether I think is the energy function is more important or the sparsity is more important, I don't have a good answer to that question. But what I like about the energy function is that you can actually regulate sparsity very easily. So you can smoothly interpolate between the regime when you have an extremely dense representation, like in multilayer perceptrons, so that all units play a role in the decisions. And then you can take this beta from your paper and take it to infinity, so that like softmax gives one outcome. And then you are in the regime winner takes all, right? But there is a whole range of interesting, there is a whole interesting range in between. And I think that's like exactly where dense associative memories particularly shine. It's not in the winner takes all regime, and it's not in the, fully democratic, so to speak, vote from all the hidden units. It's somewhere in between, so that there is some kind of democracy, but there's also some kind of, selectivity, so to speak.
There were old ideas, they were called, also Geoff Hinton brought it in, they were called population coding. That only few of your population active participate at something, at the compute. You select some this population in a smart way, and only those participate. Perhaps these ideas come out again or are revived, who knows, because it's between sparsity and because sparsity is the question also, should sparsity be a few active, but should say be very active? Population coding does not require always sparsity, but a subpopulation caring about some computational thing. But this ideas in the early 90s, I don't know. We revived the 80s. Now we should go to the 90s and revive stuff from there, perhaps.
Well, good ideas are like wine.
Never die, right?
Indeed. I have another question from Charles Foster, who says, do you see opportunity to cross-pollinate ideas between modern Hopfield networks and new development in continuous parameterized networks, for example, neural ODEs? A very difficult question.
I start, and Dmitry, you have to finish it. I think the continuously is about time continuous stuff, and I think classical formulation for Hopfield networks, and also what Dmitry has done, you have time continuous formulation of this concept of this dynamics and energy function, right, Dmitry?
Yeah, you do.
And therefore, I think there's a close connection to ODEs, where you try to simulate something which is in continuous time and then discretize it, and also you have a continuous time formulation of Hopfield networks of associative memories, and then later you discretize it. And I think, of course, I have to my opinion, yes, I think it can also be integrated in ODEs, but I don't know how and but we can make them time continuous.
Right. Yeah, I've never really thought about this deeply, but kind of, at least in those models that we discussed recently, like the dynamics of ODE, those, of course, those networks are, nonlinear, coupled nonlinear differential equations. But because they have the energy function, their behavior is actually somewhat stereotyped in the sense that they always converge to fixed points, right? But you could also imagine, other systems that have some degree of biological inspiration that have more complicated behavior, like limit cycles, etc. And kind of, broadly speaking, I think it's certainly worth thinking about these questions. I haven't done that, but seems like a reasonable connection to me.
Here, question in biology: does the brain have time to converge to a fixed point to really do that? Are there fast neurons which converge faster than others? Is this possible?
Yeah, again, like in biology, there is like a plethora of different time scales. So there are neurons that converge very fast. There are neurons that have very slow time scales, and kind of. So honest answer, I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows. But for example, in light of these results that Sepp mentioned earlier, that kind of at least in the regime when you take this coefficient beta to be sufficiently large, right? You can see that this network actually do converge after like a single update, and you can get like sufficiently close to the local minimum even after like a single update of the state, and. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it does. It doesn't. It's kind of depends on the specific choice of this parameter beta or the activation function. But it's like, again, like for example, think about contrastive trainings of, say, restricted Boltzmann machines, right? There we also have the same problem that kind of it takes a lot of time for those systems to equilibrate before we can apply learning. But then people figured out that sometimes doing one-step update of Monte Carlo is enough, and maybe something of that sort happens here as well. And kind of like Sepp's results certainly hint that something of that sort is going on here.
Here I have to jump in because Geoff Hinton once came to me and said, "Hey, I have it now. I don't have to go to the steady state. One step is enough." To give a feeling where we're going to, and that was this contrastive divergence idea for this Boltzmann machines. And he always argued, "Hey, why should the brain go exactly to the fixed point if I know in what directions get? Perhaps it's sufficient for making decisions." And it was very convincing, as he explained it it's a long time ago. And yes, perhaps it's the brain. Perhaps we don't go to a fixed point, even if we are far away, but we know in what direction we will move.
Yeah.
Very nice. Very nice. I have another question, which brings us, I think, into the realm of Bayesian analysis. If you're thinking of a neural network architecture to predict not just a pattern or class of patterns, but also provide an uncertainty estimate of the prediction, could you build that well with your new Hopfield layers? Or could that benefit from external memories / emotions that you mentioned before? What about a good framework for updating the confidence as we go along online learning?
Here I have an idea, and the guys from physics will agree. We have this beta parameter, which could be also interpreted as inverse noise. And I can also interpret how sure you are about what's going on. And perhaps if you're not sure, you average over your thing. If you're quite sure, you pick one particular pattern. And with this, you can say how reliable are my visual inputs, or how reliable are my sensory inputs, how reliable is my access to other systems. And if I'm not very sure about it, I would use a small beta, which means high temperature. And high temperature means I'm not so committed. Everything is possible. Perhaps later I can be more committed. But this beta is for me be transferred it then into a mixture of Gauss, and the beta is more or less the covariance matrix, the sigma. And therefore we know how sure we are, how peaky our fixed point is. And this comes automatically by including the inverse temperature, or to include temperatures there, and interpreting temperature as confidence in the data I'm processing.
Very nice answer. So would you then argue that one should make beta as well trainable, the parameter itself? And maybe somehow local?
Not trainable, but adjustable. Adjustable according to how sure you're about your input. Like if the input is not very well measured or not very reliable, work with a higher temperature, because you don't want to be committed, because perhaps the environment changes and you have a wrong guess.
Very nice. So I don't see any question on the chat at the moment. Please, everyone, feel free to ask. And in the absence of that, I will fill my own curiosity. And now that I have you guys as victims right in front of me, so let me ask a question. There have been attempts, obviously, for a long time to introduce memory or some form of memory into neural networks. I mean, one attempt I remember was the neural Turing machine, where it's actually like a chip, where it's a controlled process, or there's a controller there. How would you compare that to that, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of the method you propose?
I go ahead. I know the development. So one of the very first things was from Jason Weston, some memory networks, where I started doing a dot products and picking the largest dot product, which is actually nothing else than taking the maximum. But if you take the maximum, you have problems with making derivatives and so on, yeah. And then the cool idea comes, yeah, why not using the soft max? And then you're not so committed, and now you're end-to-end differentiable. And this was always a problem, being end-to-end differentiable. And I know these ideas were also very long ago by time delay neural network, where you don't know the time delay, and you put a softmax on top of it. Each delay line gets a parameter, and then you get more and more committed via the softmax. It's always, you know, it's one delay line, it's t-7, but you don't know it. And now you have to make it differentiable. How do you make it differentiable? By putting a distribution over it. It's a distribution becomes more and more committed until it picks out one item. That's what was always done. And this is also with neural Turing machines, all these kind of things. First of all, you have to make it differentiable on the one hand, and therefore introduce somehow some things like softmax distributions, which get more and more like a delta distribution over time, and then pick out one item. For example, I want to pick out this memory entry. And I think it was a development from Max, from doing this discrete computations to make them more and more differentiable. And nowadays, also, if you look at the transformers, sometimes you don't have this property anymore that you pick out one item, but you average over certain positions. The averaging mechanism is much more important than identifying a single item, a single piece of information I've stored. And the memory networks, all these kind of memories started with, I want to pull out one single item. No, nowadays looks more, you want to average over the right pieces and see what was in the past.
Right. And I just want to, I of course 100% agree with the differentiability advantage, but also what you just said, like Hopfield networks is like modern Hopfield networks is a very natural mathematical tool that allows you smoothly interpolate between the regime when you pick one item that is the best match and you average over all the items. And there is all kinds of, interesting regimes in between. And that's all kind of, controlled in a nice and, parametric way by a couple of parameters. And that's, I think, a really appealing aspect of this network. They're like so versatile that they can do like pretty much anything that you can think of in terms of like memory, content addressable memory retrievals, which I think is a really nice property of these networks.
I have to agree. I give you an example here also. We had an experiment where K nearest neighbor was very good on this task. And then we used this modern Hopfield networks and we were even better. What was the nice thing? Sometimes the Hopfield network made one nearest neighbor, but sometimes it averaged over a certain thing. And it could integrate all this kind, one nearest neighbor and 10 nearest neighbor in one network. And it was much better than one nearest neighbor or a K nearest neighbor.
Yeah, and it can decide by itself when it wants one nearest neighbor or 10 nearest neighbors, or it wants to look at the entire data set and do pooling. Yeah. So that's the coolest aspect about these systems. I completely agree with you.
Yeah, now and this is a big advantage, and we saw it. Not always, but in some things it's fantastic. It's fantastic.
Very interesting. Very interesting. There's a cogent comment by Mary Walton. In a dynamical network, the time to converge from an initial clue to the relevant memory should be a measure of confidence in recall. So I guess that goes towards the the Bayesian statement.
That could be that could certainly be one possible way of measuring confidence. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So nice. That's a very interesting idea.
And this would also agree with the beta parameter. If you put it very high, you're confident in converge in one step. If you do it very low, it takes longer. Yes, it fits completely. I also agree.
Good. There is a question from Mikola Kaplenko, who said, if memory of reinforcement learning agent will be implemented as modern Hopfield networks that tend to converge to store attractor states, how good is this agent, or how good is this agent can do exploration, or how well can this agent do exploration in the exploitation problem? That's probably a very hard question.
It's depending on how you implement it. But again, with the beta parameter, you can introduce something like temperature, noise. You can do this. But I think in the reinforcement learning, you have a huge advantage. We didn't go into this because now you can associate situations with this was good, there was a good outcome, there was a bad outcome. And we thought about, we have in the reinforcement learning, we did this stuff with delayed rewards. We have this radar paper. And we thought about using Hopfield networks. You encounter some situation and much later you see, hey, what action I did, it was not a good, I'm a bad situation, I have a low reward. In another situation, I have high reward. And also sometimes you're not sure, is this reward associated with the situation you encounter? But using Hopfield networks to associate reward and penalties with some state actions, I think could be a fruitful way to think. We thought in this direction, but we don't have something implemented.
Very nice. There's another question from Brian Chung. Is it possible to utilize these modern Hopfield memories without requiring backpropagation through these structures along the rest of the network? It seems like you want system 1 and system 2 learning. A component would have to sit outside the backpropagation learning loop.
Oh, so that's a hard one. Without requiring backpropagation, it could be. We thought in direction, I don't know whether it's the right answer, to use instead of backpropagation energy like neural networks, where each compartment is trying to minimize its own energy and communicating the result to the next compartment, which again does its minimization. If you do it layer-wise, it's like this: one layer converges and gives the result to another layer. But you can do it much more complex. And also the last layer would be only, if you see the error function, also the energy function will also communicate, hey, I want to have this. Can you give me this and communicate this? I don't have something clear in mind how to do it, but by doing just energy minimization locally, there perhaps you can communicate information, but I don't have a fixed idea how to do it. Perhaps Dmitry, you know.
I mean, I don't have a good idea either, but again, kind of, you know, as we sort of touched on briefly earlier in this call, I don't really see any problems of combining backpropagation with some forms of Hebbian learning, or maybe like, you know, maximum likelihood training, for example. There was a very nice blog about a week ago written by Matthias Ball, where he noticed that if you actually take what we call model B, like the, you know, a modern Hopfield network with the softmax, you can actually exactly calculate the partition function. It's just a set of coupled Gaussian integrals that you can evaluate exactly. And like, you know, typical problems that you would face in training those systems using maximum likelihood training, they just go away for that specific model, because the partition function, you can just write down an analytic formula for it. And you could also use, you know, some kind of, you know, Hebbian-inspired methods for training various parts of that architecture. So if you see a computational benefit of doing this, I think it's totally fine. And sometimes, like, Hebbian updates, they could be slower than backpropagation updates. They could also be faster than backpropagation updates. There's all kinds of freedom of how you could combine those methods. So I think.
But perhaps there's potential also. Yes, I agree. But also, if you think about local learning, because you can optimize the energy locally, there's stuff like equilibrium propagation. This kind of ideas. I don't know whether the Hopfield networks would help this equilibrium propagation ideas, where you want to do local updates. I don't know, might be.
Yeah, I haven't played with equilibrium propagation, but you know, I kind of off top of my head, I don't really see any like obvious reason why they wouldn't work, but maybe there is some reason. Yeah, so I just don't know.
The only thing would be that we have only local computations, because you have this small energy things, and they compute for their own, don't care about the other, and they have channels where they communicate to each other, where one compartment can initiate a new settling down of the other compartment. But I don't know whether it makes sense or not.
Very nice. So again, anyone, please post your questions. I have one for you, Dmitry. In your paper, which I like very much, you also spoke about what's biologically kind of plausible, and maybe also things that are not plausible. What's your take on which bits are maybe not plausible, and how do you think this could actually influence what we also just discussed, how memory could work in the future? Although that's also a very unfair question, I guess.
Right. So like in that paper that Michael is referring to, what we did is the following. We tried to kind of unroll the modern Hopfield network with feature neurons, so that we add a lot of hidden neurons to the neural network. And by doing so, you can construct a network that has only pairwise interactions between the neurons, so that it has a normal structure of biological neurons that have dendrites, that have axons, and like so interact only through synaptic connections. Now, of course, in order to make such a network not only biologically plausible, but also a Hopfield network, so that you can write down an energy function, you would need to assume certain symmetry on the synaptic weights, right? So you would have to assume that the synaptic strength of the synapse that connects neuron I and neuron mu from the hidden layer is exactly the same as neuron mu and neuron I. Biologically, those two things, they could be entirely different. But if you kind of study a more general recurrent neural network when you do not have that symmetry, then it's a very biological and very interesting recurrent neural network, but then you don't have the energy function. And if you don't have the energy function, because you're dealing with a system of coupled nonlinear differential equations, they could have all kinds of crazy behaviors, right? And it's like the existence of energy function that makes them converge to a fixed point. But there's nothing wrong with studying such systems. I think those systems are even more interesting from machine learning perspective, perhaps because they admit, they allow more rich behaviors for the dynamical trajectories. And I think at some point it's certainly worth investigating them.
Very nice.
Do we have further questions?
Yes, there is one from Brian Chang. Since modern Hopfield network has such a high capacity in terms of retrieval, having it in the same learning loop as the rest of the network limits its receptive field to a single sample. If it were able to sit outside the backprop training loop, could it help aspects like meta-learning and learning to learn?
I like this idea because it has at least it has a different dynamics than the rest of the network, which only is propagating information through the network. It might be that we can add it as a compartment to meta learning, and actually some learning algorithms do that. They memorize things like variances of certain patterns or stuff like this, or versus learning rates, where each parameter has its own learning rate, and you have to memorize the learning rate for each parameter, stuff like this. So learning methods where you have to memorize stuff. And here it would come in very handy. It would be very easy. I didn't think about that, but yes, it might do, or it can also influence, modulate the computation of other networks. Like if you have a convolutional neural network, you have a Hopfield network outside which memorizes. I'm now working on grass. Or it's darker, so contrast is different. I memorize different images from the past, and I adapt some computational features of the main network because I memorize from the past. And this exists in the brain, I think, with this contrast adaptation. And I think our brain is highly adaptive, or orientation adaptive. I know this pinwheel stuff. Perhaps here, Hopfield networks can be used to modulate the computation of the main network.
Very interesting. Very, very interesting. We have another question. I wonder whether the time dependence in your energy function could play a role in developing local learning confidence estimates. I guess we're dragged back to the Bayesian world.
Yeah. So I think we sort of touched on that recently. I think that certainly is one way to think about this. Yeah, so you can think about, and that's of course is related to the parameter beta, right, in the softmax. So like those two things are not entirely independent, but certainly the longer the convergence takes, you can think that it's like less confident or something like this.
Yes. I agree. I have the same feeling, and it's not exploited until now. If you think in the transformer world, you have always this fixed beta with 1 over square root of kd, but that this could be a very important parameter in terms of noise in physics. Every physicist would immediately see, hey, that could be a noise or inverse noise, and you can exploit this as a new feature. It's not done right now, and I think there's a huge opportunity to go in this direction.
I agree.
Very nice. Very, very nice. I think I don't see any questions for the moment, so let me throw in maybe something which is a bit more crystal ball. Where do you think, I mean, do you, both of you have a challenge of maybe, or a hope that with this, with these new memory networks, maybe certain problems could be tackled, or maybe in an easier way than before? And if we look, let's say over the next year or next 2 years, would you, and especially the audience that we have, could you think of such a challenge? What should people work on?
On everything. You have on mobility, on traffic, climate change, health. Think about COVID. For example, you have an example. I don't know whether I'm allowed to say this, with synthesis, making new compounds, and it was until now very, very hard for pharma companies to develop the synthesis way. And they used machine learning tools, they used neural networks, and if you have many examples, it worked. But sometimes you have only a compound, and you know only from one similar compound. You already produce it, you already have a template. And now we used this Hopfield networks, and it's completely mind-blowing. Now we can get synthesis paths, even if there was in the database only one example. You cannot learn from one example, but what you can do, you can store this example. You can pull out this template. How did I produce this molecule out of your memory? Slightly adjust it, and then you have a new one, and it was unbelievably good. I'm not sure whether I'm allowed to say this, because in the pharma this is a huge achievement. It's so interesting things that sometimes you have only one example, and instead of learning it, it doesn't work. You put it in a memory and pull it out if you need it. But to your question, Michael, like transformer are used for everything. Hopfield networks can be used for everything where transformer are used. But if you think in current terms of enriching deep learning architectures with Hopfield networks, you have a much broader application field, because you can do much more. You can do different things in your memory. Transformer only use the information from the previous layer, but you can do all kind of things, all kind of references or whatever. You can build much richer and complex and weird architectures and solve problems, which are not solved until now.
Yeah, I completely agree. Kind of, like these new models, they're so flexible that you could also reuse them for standard stuff that people are already using. For that reason, but at the same time, like the standard stuff is only like one little corner. And like in general, these new models, they can do many more interesting things. So in some sense, they are expected to work better. They're expected to work better on a much more diverse set of problems.
Yeah.
And I mean, again, I completely agree with Sepp that, pretty much I can see a lot of different applications that can be benefit from these new ideas, but kind of, one aspect that I think have not really played yet substantially in the community is this aspect of interpretability, that indeed by kind of, playing with, sharpness of the activation function, so this parameter beta, you can actually like easily interpolate between completely uninterpretable representations and highly interpretable representations. And I think especially from the perspective of biological sciences, where like there is a ton of, for example, genomic data, but no one knows, what that genomics data mean. Those kind of interpretability features of modern Hopfield networks, they potentially could be extremely valuable for discovering of new patterns.
Absolutely agree. Yes, yes.
Very nice.
But you will also see that transformers will come more and more. You can also call them Hopfield networks, but Hopfield networks have more possibilities. Transformer have only one kind of computation ideas, what you put in the memory. Please open your mind and use Hopfield networks, then you can do more. And even their first tries that transformers go into vision, try to tackle problems where CNNs are world champions. Who knows what's coming, because it's a very powerful computational concept we are talking about.
Very nice. I think this is a fitting end to this fireside chat. Thank you very, very much indeed, Dima and Sepp. That was amazing. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did, and speak to you soon.
Yes.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Thanks a lot. Thanks for listening.